Section B, whoever looks to desire. Shift in the center of gravity. General Audience number 38 of September 3rd, 1980. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ limits himself to recalling the commandment, "You shall not commit adultery," without evaluating the corresponding behavior of his listeners. What we have said earlier about this topic comes from other sources, above all, from Christ's discourse with the Pharisees, in which he appeals to the beginning, from Matthew chapter 19, verse 8, and Mark chapter 10, verse 6. In the Sermon on the Mount, Christ omits this evaluation, or rather, he takes it for granted. What he says in the statement's second part, "But I say to you," is something more than polemics against the teachers of the law or the moralists of the Torah, and it is something more than polemics in regard to the evaluation of the ethos of the Old Testament. It is a direct transition to the new ethos. Christ seems to leave aside all the disputes about the ethical meaning of adultery on the level of legislation and casuistry, in which the essential interpersonal relationship between husband and wife had been considerably obscured by the objective property relation and thus acquired another dimension. Christ says, "But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to desire her has already committed adultery with her in his heart," Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. This passage always brings to mind the old translation, "has already made her an adulteress in his heart," a translation that, perhaps better than the Italian translation used now, expresses the fact that here we are dealing with a purely interior and one-sided act. In this way, then, adultery committed in the heart is in some sense set over against adultery committed in the body. We must ask ourselves, why has the center of gravity of sin shifted? Further, what is the authentic meaning of the analogy? If according to its basic meaning, adultery can, in fact, only be a sin committed in the body, in what sense does what man commits in his heart also deserve to be called adultery? The words with which Christ lays the foundation of the new ethos need to be on their part deeply rooted in anthropology. Before we respond to these questions, we will dwell a little on the expression in Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28 that makes, in some sense, the transfer or shift of the meaning of adultery from the body to the heart. It consists of words about desire. Christ speaks about concupiscence, whoever looks to desire. This is the expression that needs to be analyzed in detail to understand the statement as a whole. Here we have to return to the analysis above, the aim of which, I would say, was to reconstruct the image of the man of concupiscence at the very beginning of history. The man about whom Christ speaks in the Sermon on the Mount, the man who looks to desire, is without doubt the man of concupiscence. Precisely for this reason, because he shares in the concupiscence of the body, he desires and looks to desire. The image of the man of concupiscence, which we reconstructed above, will help us now to interpret the desire about which Christ speaks according to Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. We are concerned here not only with a psychological interpretation, but at the same time with a theological interpretation. Christ speaks in the context of human experience and at the same time in the contexts of the work of salvation. These two contexts in some way superimpose themselves on each other and interpenetrate. And this has an essential and constitutive meaning for the whole ethos of the gospel, and particularly for the content of the verb to desire, or to look to desire. With these expressions, the teacher appeals first to the experience of those who were his immediate listeners, but he also appeals to the experience and consciousness of human beings in every time and place. In fact, although the language of the gospel has a universal communicative power, Christ's immediate audience, whose consciousness was formed by the Bible, most likely saw desire as tied to the many precepts and admonitions present, above all in the wisdom books, in which we find repeated warnings against the concupiscence of the body, as well as counsels for how to preserve oneself from it. The wisdom tradition. The wisdom tradition, as we know, had a particular interest in the ethics and the morals of Israelite society. In these warnings and counsels, found, for example, in Proverbs, chapter 5, verses 3 through 6, verses 15 to 20, chapter 6, verses 24 through 7, chapter 27, chapter 9, verses 19, chapter 22, verse 14, chapter 30, verse 20. Or Sirach, chapter 7, verse 19, or verses 24 to 26, chapter 9, verse 1 through 9, chapter 23, verse 22 to 27, chapter 25, verses 13 to 26, chapter 36, verses 21 to 25, and chapter 42, verse 6, and verses 9 through 14. And even Ecclesiastes, chapter 7, verse 26 to 28, and chapter 9, verse 9. What strikes us immediately is a certain one-sidedness, inasmuch as the warnings are above all directed toward men. This could mean that warnings are particularly necessary for them. As for the woman, it is true that in these warnings and counsels, she appears more often as an occasion of sin, or as a downright seducer of whom to beware. But nevertheless, one should recognize that in addition to warning men to be on guard against women and the seduction of their charm, which pulls men toward sin, see Proverbs chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, chapter 6, verses 24 to 29, and Sirach chapter 26, verse 9 through 12. Proverbs and Sirach also deliver eulogies about the woman who is the perfect companion for her husband. See Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10ff. And they likewise sing the praises of the beauty and charm of a good wife, who knows how to make her husband happy. A modest wife adds charm to charm, and no balance can weigh the value of a chaste soul. Like the sun rising in the heights of the Lord, so the beauty of a good wife adorns her house. Like the shining lamp on the holy lampstand, so is a beautiful face on a noble figure. Like golden pillars on silver bases, so are graceful legs and steadfast feet. A wife's grace delights her husband, and her knowledge strengthens his bones. Sirach chapter 26, verses 15 to 18. In the wisdom tradition, a frequent warning contrasts with this eulogy of the woman wife, namely the warning against the beauty and charm of a woman who is not one's own wife, and who is thus a motive for temptation and an occasion for adultery. Do not desire her beauty in your heart. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 25. In Sirach chapter 9, verses 1 through 9, the same warning is expressed more earnestly. Turn away your eyes from a shapely woman, and do not look intently at beauty belonging to another. For the beauty of a woman many have perished. On account of it, love burns like a fire. Sirach chapter 9, verse 8. The meaning of the wisdom texts is primarily pedagogical. They teach virtue and seek to protect the moral order by pointing to the law of God and to experience in a broad sense. In addition, they excel in a particular knowledge of the human heart. We might say they develop a specific moral psychology, though without falling into psychologism. They are in some way close to Christ's appeal to the heart reported by Matthew. See Matthew 5, verses 27 to 28. Though one cannot say that they show any tendency to transform ethos in a fundamental way. The authors of these books use their knowledge of human interiority to teach morals within the limits of the ethos that prevailed in their historical period and that was substantially confirmed by them. Koheleth, among others, brings this confirmation together with his own philosophy of human existence, which, even if it has an influence on the manner in which he formulates his warnings and counsels, does not change the fundamental structure that undergirds ethical evaluation. Such a transformation of ethos had to await the Sermon on the Mount. Nevertheless, the extremely perceptive knowledge of human psychology in the wisdom tradition was certainly not without significance for the circle of those who listened in person and immediately to this sermon. Just as in virtue of the prophetic tradition, the audience was in some sense prepared for understanding the concept of adultery correctly. So in virtue of the wisdom tradition, it was prepared for understanding the words about the concupiscent look, or adultery, in the heart. We shall have to return to the analysis of concupiscence in the Sermon on the Mount.